Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Fox, and this is the History of Immigration in the U.S. podcast. And I'll be your host today. I will be talking about the brief history of the Filipino immigration to the United States today. And the question is, what were some of the most significant waves for Filipinos? After the Immigration Act of 1924, the United States had seen a halt on immigration from many Asian countries, including the Filipino community. But the Great Depression definitely boosted the amount of immigrants from the Philippines flowing into the United States of America, as the amount of demand for jobs and workers had skyrocketed. But with this increase in demand also eventually came a surplus of workers, but also a number of discriminatory policies to get rid of these surplus workers. The United States has definitely had a deep history of implementing one-sided discriminatory policies like the Filipino immigrants had dealt with. To stop this wave of immigrants, the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934 was passed to stop Filipino immigrants from coming to the United States, making the process much slower for them to enter the United States than before. But why did the Filipino community want to immigrate to the United States so badly? As early as 1898, the Filipino community wanted to come into the United States. This was because of the Spanish-American War, when the United States had claimed the Philippines as a colony. Although during this time period, many Asian countries have been stopped from having immigrants flow into the U.S., this was an open opportunity for the Filipino community to move into the United States in search of work or a better life. This was an open opportunity for everyone in the country of the Philippines to really step forward and get their foot in the door with the United States, as I just mentioned. So why did the United States want this flow of immigrants into the U.S.? As I mentioned, the Great Depression had taken a huge toll on the United States in terms of its economy. Not only the U.S., but historically many other countries do this in order to dig their way out of economic collapses. Often many of these workers from the Philippines were employed at companies as fisheries, farms, or household workers along the west coast of the United States. A lot of these jobs were meant for skilled workers in these fields of work, and the Filipino community had fit their demand perfectly for the time period. As we went deeper into the 1960s and 1970s, the U.S. had started to also receive many immigrants from the Philippines who were even more qualified than before, with college educations allowing them to land higher income jobs. And that brings us into transnational ties being maintained or not between the Filipino people in the U.S. and their families back home. Initially, many of these ties were hard for the immigrants to maintain because they made so little income with these jobs that they had been given when they arrived to the U.S. So many of the immigrants had come initially and were not able to go back home or have spare money to give to their families. But later on, when the Filipino community started to immigrate more into the U.S., higher paying jobs were given to them, and these transnational ties were boosted and connected. They were able to send money to their families and go back to their families, of course. But also this allowed for whole families to come to the United States who seek permanent residency instead of temporary residency or status. And this brings me to leave you off with just a few questions. So what is your opinion on how the U.S. has handled immigration in the past, not only with the Filipino community, but with many other communities that will be talked about on this podcast, such as the Japanese community, the Chinese community, and many other countries. And another question I have for you is, what is your opinion on how the U.S. can handle immigration better in the future and for future immigrations to the United States? For instance, how could the U.S. handle the immigration over the U.S.-Mexico border better? Although we are talking about Asian countries immigrating to the U.S., there is still involvement with many other countries in the world and those countries immigrating to the United States. And that brings us to the end of our podcast for today on the history of immigration to the U.S. for the Filipino community. Thank you.